Okay. Hey y'all, how y'all doing? AMH 2091. We are wrapping up our third week. So this is my lecture, my week 3 lecture. I'm posting it today on Thursday. Um, Please, if you have not already, check announcements. The midterm is coming up. I know I mentioned in the syllabus that the midterm would be week 3. It's going to be technically after week 3, right? We'll have the midterm on Monday. Check the announcement for specifics. Essentially, it's going to be 2 out of 3 essay questions or 3 short answer questions. You'll have to choose which 2 you want to answer. All right. Of course, all relevant to what we've covered in class thus far in these 3 weeks, all right, which has been quite a bit, right, because we're moving at a rapid rate. So we're keeping that rate going this week. All right, last week we talked about the Haitian Revolution and its impacts. We talked about cultural resistance. We talked about the Stonewall Rebellion and Maroon resistance, right? If you haven't noticed thus far, right, this class, this course really centers on resistance, right? It's a specific choice, right? That as we tell our history, as we look back over the course of our history, that when we look with our own lens, right? We talked about the proverb at the beginning of the semester: until lions have historians, the lore of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Well, what we're trying to do in this course is to give lions historians, right? And so in order to do that, right, we have to tell the history from the perspective, the lens, the point of view of the lion. And when we do that from the perspective of our people of African descent, Black people, we see the ways that we fought oppression, captivity in all of its forms, right? And so in this course, the resistance is what we want to make sure is understood as the context for our various experiences, right? Our various challenges, right? The different forms of oppression that we faced, right? We're studying the oppression through the lens of how we fought it, how we resisted it, how we attempted to retain our humanity, our dignity, our manhood, our womanhood, right? All right. And so this week, I started with a reading to have us understand the widespread impact of the Haitian Revolution. That, again, I cannot overstate that all Black people, if you are of African descent in the Western Hemisphere and your ancestors came through captivity, we owe a debt to Haiti, because it is the Haitian Revolution that, if you can imagine a domino, and when you knock down that first domino, then a whole lot of other things, the Haitian Revolution was that first domino, and a big one it was, right? It inspired rebellions and revolutions and resistance in South America and Central America and the United States, right? It inspired Maroon resistance. It inspired all forms and manner of resistance. It also inspired a lot of fear among white plantation owners and captors. We talked about that last class. What we may not have talked about is that, last lecture. But what I wanted to talk about this lecture is the impact it had on the trade in African people, right? So the Haitian Revolution ends in 1804. In 1807 is when the British outlaw the trade in African people. What does that mean? They made it illegal for representatives of European nations to go to the coast of Africa and pay for African people, right? To pay for property, slaves, what have you, right? That other folks call slaves, that we know were African people, right? They made that illegal. So they did not outlaw slavery. They didn't make it illegal for folks to own African people as property or people, period, right? But they did make it illegal the purchase of, right? So they kind of cut off the source, and still people, went and purchased even after the British outlawed it, right? But they did so illegally, right? The British had a police force that they would, use to police the waters and what have you. They did so kind of in violation of this British mandate, all right? So 1807 kind of marks the beginning of the end of captivity in the hemisphere, because it is the end of folks being able to just easily go to the coast of Africa and purchase African people. And why did they do that? Right? Some people say that the British did this because they had such good hearts. Some people say they did this because they were, they saw that it was barbaric, and they wanted to end the practice because they were too civilized for that, right? And no, this is not the case, right? Haiti was a big reason. The Haitian Revolution was a big reason that they outlawed the additional importation of Africans into the Americas. Because what they saw with Haiti is that a potential consequence is that the black people could end up taking over. The British did not want more Haitis. They were afraid that more Haitis would be generated if we continue to keep bringing African people over in large numbers to work in this system. They will fight, and we believe there will be more Haitis, right? A large reason why many people in the hemisphere, many white people, plantation owners, especially Europeans who were, right, they were very scared of there being another Haiti. And the British took action. They said, you know what, we're going to stop it so that it doesn't build that, right? But people could still breed. They could still breed their own captives, right? They could still kind of, produce captives from the womb, as we learned last class. However, this marked the 1807, the British outlawing of the trade in African people marked the beginning of the end. It would be another 60, 70 years before captivity would be totally done with in the Western Hemisphere. But in 1807 is when it started, okay? And what we see after 1807 also is a growing abolitionism movement. So I gave you all a reading on Black abolitionism, right? I want y'all to understand that the larger abolitionism movement was a movement that was not solely Black. In fact, it was not started by Black people. There were abolitionists in Britain and in Europe. There were abolitionists here in the United States of, Europeans, Americans here who were advocating for the end of captivity. They felt like this was not economically the best move, the best direction for the United States or the Western world to continue to go in. This is another reason why the British outlawed it, right? That there was as captivity is growing, right? I told y'all it grew from a trickle to a flood, right? Over centuries. As it grew, what also grew was the Industrial Revolution, right? In fact, the Industrial Revolution grew and became a thing on the backs of African people, right? It is only through decades and centuries of free labor provided by African people that the technological advancement was able to happen. That folks were able to come up with machines and other mechanized ways of processing raw materials and what have you, right? And so the Industrial Revolution is happening economically, right? The world is changing based on the introduction of industry and of technology. And so many folks are moving away from rural, agrarian, right, economies that are dependent on slave labor, right, the labor of captives, particularly captive Africans, because the world is moving in a different direction, right? And so we see that after the Haitian Revolution and after the 1807 outlawing of the trade, right? Many folks are lending their voice to, there needing to be an end to captivity, okay, for different reasons, right? For different reasons. But Black people, right? This is African American history. Our voices in the abolitionism movement in the United States are from a place of freedom seeking, right? Freedom seeking. What's the word I'm looking for? Freedom seeking energy and spirit, right? Many of the abolitionists who were part of this abolitionism movement and who formed an abolitionism, a movement that was Black. And that while there was a larger white abolitionism movement, the Black abolitionism movement was characterized by folks who actually had lived in captivity, who had actually themselves experienced captivity. And so their voices had an urgency that was informed by their experience, right? And so some of the speeches, I posted 3 speeches, please read them all in their entirety. Very important for y'all to kind of get a glimpse into what that was. And so what I want you all to understand here about this Black abolitionism movement, this is an example. In fact, it was during this period that we see really an introduction of this method of resistance, which I'm calling rhetorical resistance. This is now, and I want y'all to make a note of this, this is now the 4th current of resistance that we're introducing. The last one, there are 4 major currents of resistance that I'm outlining here that formulate, right, this river of African American history, right? We talked about the first 2 that have been, in effect from the very moment that, Black people began to be captured. And that is Maroon resistance, right? That emphasizes self-governance, right? Maroon resistance, where, Africans escaping plantations, escaping captivity, one by one or even in groups, and building lives, families, communities, even nations, right? In swamps, in forests, in mountains, in areas that were hard to access, right? And sometimes then would even from those strongholds continue to fight, continue to maybe raid plantations or what have you, to defend themselves, right? So we have Maroon resistance. We also have rebellion. Rebellion is direct confrontation, right? It's not escape. It's not flight. It's, let's go head up. It's, whatever weapons I have at my disposal, right? Mainly fire. For African people, fire was our friend, because fire, a weapon we always had access to. And it's a weapon that spreads easily, right? And so in the history of rebellions of African people against captivity, fire is a main character. Right? So we have Maroon resistance, we have rebellion, we introduced last week cultural resistance, right? This is resistance waged through memory, remembering of a cultural identity, remembering of traditions, remembering of ways of being and seeing the world, right? And we talked ways of speaking and communicating, ways of singing and praising and worshiping, ways of building and, building family, right? And so, this is a major form of resistance for African American people, because we know that captivity was designed, that oppression has been designed to have us forget and become disconnected with our roots, with our origins, with our past. All right. So the fourth current of resistance is rhetorical resistance, right? It's resistance through your rhetoric, through your words, right? It's the resistance through the spoken word, through the written word, right? It's resistance through argument, right? It is Black people speaking up and speaking out against our captors, speaking out against injustice, speaking to each other to inspire us to fight, to resist, to remember who we are, right? Resistance through the word, right? And this resistance can be, again, it can be speaking out against what some folks call speaking truth to power, right? So when you're speaking to your antagonist, your enemy, your oppressor, telling, telling them to stop, right? Calling out the hypocrisy in their justification of their oppression, right? Breaking down analytically and intellectually the premise, right, of their domination, right? But also speaking to your own people. So we saw Henry Highland Garnett speak to his people. David Walker was speaking to his people, right? All right. So I want y'all to keep those in mind, right? Especially for this midterm that's coming up. These four currents of resistance. And I want y'all to think to yourself, which one of these currents of resistance resonates the most with you? If you were alive during the time of our captivity, which current of resistance would you most likely have chosen? Maroon resistance, right? Self-governance, rebellion, right? Cultural resistance, right? Or rhetorical resistance, right? Which one would you have chosen, do you believe? All right. Okay, moving on. And you can actually respond to that question. In fact, I want you to respond to that question in your discussion board post this week. All right. So we also talked about Nat Turner's rebellion here. I'm not going to spend too much time here. Please engage the material. All right. Some of you all, I've been noticing when you're putting your discussion board post in, you're only responding to my lecture, almost as if you're only listening to my lecture and not going through the course material. As we move on in this section, I'm going to be giving lower and lower grades for that, because I need you all to engage the material, not just listen to me talk, right? This talk is supposed to highlight and point you to and kind of bring all of the materials together. All right. So Nat Turner, please watch the clip, read the readings around the importance, the significance of Nat Turner's rebellion that was inspired by David Walker's appeal, a very important piece of rhetorical resistance. And so many people believe that Nat Turner's rebellion, in part, at least in part, was inspired by David Walker's appeal. All right. Nat Turner's rebellion. We find a theme, a continuing theme of the aftermath of rebellion, right? After Nat Turner's rebellion, Black people are really in the region and in the area of his rebellion in Virginia. There's a great response of Black folk being killed, right? A reprisal, right? A tightening of the machinery of control in response to his rebellion, similar to the Stono Rebellion, right? So we see a pattern in terms of, right, as we fight, then the response needing to then go over the top to suppress any folks who would be inspired, right, to continue with the fight, right? And yet still, right, there's always resistance that follows. All right, let's talk about also the Underground Railroad during this time. All right, we're familiar, many of us, about the Underground Railroad through the eyes of Harriet Tubman and through the name of Harriet Tubman. Very important name, conductor on the Underground Railroad. However, the Underground Railroad is bigger than Harriet Tubman. There were other conductors other than Harriet Tubman. There were other, other paths. There were more routes going north than just up the eastern seaboard, right? From Florida to Georgia to, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, right? That route, right? No, there were routes that went up north, also across the Ohio River, right? Folks who were living in Kentucky, kind of Central America, wanting to move north, right? And so there's a reading there that I gave you about that course, the path that many folks took, right? And so this was a way that many African people escaped bondage up north. We talked before about the Underground Railroad going south, right? Last week, right? And that was in play. Many Africans took that Underground Railroad for over a century, right? Before the American Revolution, well after. Well, during this time, and we're talking about 1820s, folks started hitting that road north, right? The north becomes an option. After the American Revolution, captivity in the north is abolished. And so the north, from 1800 on, right? And specifically as we get into the teens and the 20s, the north becomes an option for escape. And many African people begin to avail ourselves of that option, right? We talked about the fugitive slave law this week in the materials, right? The fugitive slave law, the Fugitive Slave Act, that is in 1850, right? And this is the second one, y'all. This is the most famous one. But in the spirit of the Dikanga that we talked about, the Congo Cosmogram, and how in history, many things are cyclical, right? And they come back around. The fugitive slave, the original one, was in 1790, right? In response to many Black people escaping, right? And so this is another one, right? That builds on the tradition of the previous one. And this law was diabolical because it said that essentially any Black person, wherever you were, whether you had escaped to the north, right, and considered yourself free now, or whether you were born in the north and your folks, you had never been a captive, maybe your mom or your daddy maybe had never even been in captivity, you were in danger of being captured and sold south, sold down the river, as folks say, right? Because the law said that folks could come up, bounty hunters could come up to the north, could grab a Black person, could say that this was their slave, escaped. They could take them before a judge, and the judge, with no proof, believing the word of a white man, could stamp their paperwork, and it's legal, right? Some folks in the movie 12 Years a Slave tells a story of this. Solomon Northrop was someone who was a free man, who during this era, during this period, was sold back down south, right? Or was captured and taken back down south. All right. And we talked about the case of Margaret Garner because Black people fought this. This was a period where if you were Black in the United States, you were scared. You could be captured at any time. Your rights, no white man had to acknowledge our right to freedom or anything, right? But we didn't take that laying down. We organized amongst each other, among our communities and families, right, to protect and prevent those of us from being taken and sold down south. We moved in groups together, right? And in some cases, like in the case of Margaret Garner, where we could not, do anything else. We prevented our children even, right, by killing them in most extreme cases of our resistance, even during captivity, right? When we didn't want our children to live the reality that we were living, right? Then we would go that far, right? Suicide, we would kill ourselves sometimes, and even our babies. And we see that in the case of Margaret Garner. These are examples of resistance against captivity. Don't let anybody tell you that suicide is merely a weak man's way out, right? When we look at our history, right, in the context of resistance, many African people use suicide as a form of resistance to say that we would be the ones who are in control over our lives, and we would not surrender domination, right, over our lives to oppressors, right? Okay, moving on, right? The Civil War, right? As we move into the Civil War, which is a pivotal moment in African American history as well as in the history of this nation, right? Please be sure that you have engaged in material on the Civil War. What I want to make note of here is that Black folk, first and foremost, we weren't waiting for folk to allow us to fight in the Civil War. In large numbers, by the thousands, Black people escaped plantations. By the thousands, Black folk escaped plantations from the South in order to join the war effort, even before we were permitted legally to fight in the war. Right? It wasn't until 3 years into the war, 1863, that the Emancipation Proclamation is issued, after which it is now legal for Black folk to fight. 3 years in, right? But Black folk up until that point, by the thousands, were escaping, were leaving plantations. We were not waiting, abandoning plantations, particularly Black men, right, in order to fight in this war. Why? Well, because for us, it was not just a war between the North and the South. It was not just a war over, the economic destiny of the nation or political issues or what have you. It was a war for our freedom. It was a war for our children and their children and their children. It was a war to vindicate those of our ancestors who never got to see freedom, right? And so it wasn't a question if our labor, if our life, if our shedding of blood could help to make a future, right, for our children that was absent of captivity, then that is the choice that we made in mass. And in fact, we kind of forced the hand of the nation to say, okay, because the U.S. was getting their behinds whooped, not the U.S., excuse me, the Union was getting their behinds whooped by the Confederates. They were getting their behinds whooped royally. And it was when African people were introduced, right? It was when Black folk were now active in the war that the tide of the war changes. I want y'all to also look at the Emancipation Proclamation. Many people say that Lincoln freed us. Lincoln freed the slaves. Many of you all right now probably have that understanding. Look in the resources. I want y'all to look at the Emancipation Proclamation. Tell me, is that true? What states were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation? What slaves in what states? Right? These were states that that Lincoln had no jurisdiction in. These were states that had already seceded from the Union. And there were 4 states where Africans were held captivity that did not secede, where Lincoln had jurisdiction, and he did not free Africans in those states. Right? The move was a strategic move in order to gain the manpower of Black people, of the Black population, in service of the Union's war effort. And it is based on our participation that we won that war, that the war was won by the Union. It was largely due to our intervention. And so we see some stories here around Harriet Tubman's engagement in the Civil War, in the Combahee River Raid. Robert Smalls is another person. And there were many instances of just heroic efforts on the part of African people, right, to free ourselves. And what I want y'all to understand from this unit is that Black people, we were not freed by an external source. We freed ourselves by our actions collectively, right? Both before we were able to participate in the Civil War and by our actions as soldiers in the Civil War. All right, moving on. After the Civil War, there's a period of Reconstruction, right? And Reconstruction is usually talked about as a period where the nation is trying to put itself back together. The Union is trying to kind of, reestablish some type of order and, integrate Black people into the nation and what have you. Well, the Black experience of Reconstruction is an important one to consider, right? Because it is during this period that, yes, the Union, after their victory, had to kind of remain present in the South in order to ensure, right, that their victory was meaningful, to ensure that their order was implemented, right, and that it wasn't just business as usual. They wanted to kind of punish the South for even seceding in the first place. A lot of times that happens after wars. The winning party, implements a period where the losing party has to suffer under some indignity so that they know that they lost the war and that they got to fall in line. And so part of the North's strategy, right, to kind of to stick it to, the Southern Confederates, was to change the social order of the South, at least for a time period, right? And that involved Black people, right? So Black people who had previously been dehumanized and considered to be the lowest rungs of the social ladder are now given all of the rights of full manhood, full right to vote, right? And what have you. The right even to own land. A number of Black folks are given, land and the right to hold office, up to the highest levels of the government, right? Even in the national level, right? Black people were elected. We were able to, and so, there was institutional support from the North, but Black folk literally hit the ground running, right? There are 4 sacred rights that we hit the ground that were very important for us coming off of the plantation. I want y'all to make note of these 4 sacred rights. That the right to own land. Land was important for us. Without land, there was no freedom. Land was what was the meaning, was the substance of freedom. Without freedom, without land, then our freedom was not meaningful for our folks' land. The right to bear arms, right? To be able to protect that land, and to be able to protect our lives, and to be able to prevent us from the potentiality of white Southerners coming back to re-enslave Black people, which many of us at the time thought was a possibility. The right to own land, the right to bear arms, the right to education. Education was so important for us. Self-education, right? We had been denied the right to read, the right to, like we talked about from last class after the Stoner Rebellion, right? So education was very important for us, and also the right to vote and hold office. And all of these things were sacred, and we engaged them at a deep level during the Civil War in service of our independence. What was most important for Black people coming off of the plantation, fresh out of the Civil War, was our independence. And so whatever rights that were sacred to us were sacred to us because of their function in helping us to establish some level of independence for our families, right? Because for us, freedom and independence were synonymous. Freedom without independence wasn't freedom at all. So I want to ask you all, which of those 4 sacred rights, if you had to make a choice to emphasize one as most important coming out of something like the Civil War, coming off the plantation, which would you have voted for and sided with? All right. The Reconstruction was short-lived. The North eventually pulled out in stages, right? But over 3-4 years, they pulled out. And so by 1877, there is no more Northern presence in the South. And with the white forces of the white Southerners of the South reestablished the social order that existed previous to the Civil War. And that results in some other forms of oppression being created that Black folk had to deal with, particularly slavery by another name, right? The white Southern population they chose to figure out how they could reestablish the social order. That meant how they could reestablish captivity, slavery, right? But it wasn't illegal. It was illegal now, right? So they had to do it in another way, in another form, but make it legal. And so they did that through practices like convict leasing, practices like debt peonage, practices like vagrancy statutes justifying the arrests of large numbers of Black men who they would send to work on prison farms or hire out to corporations and make big money off of, right? We also know about tenant farming and sharecropping as ways to bind Black people to the land and keep black folk dependent and to serve and continue as labor forces, right, to make money for landowners and plantation owners and what have you, right? And so this was a period of the original mass incarceration, right, in Jim Crow South. I forgot to mention something. The Jim Crow, which is implemented post-Reconstruction, right? The order of white supremacy that is called Jim Crow, as we know it today, was a recycling of the black codes that came out during Reconstruction, right? Black codes that were passed by Andrew Johnson that you should have seen in the readings, right? Those black codes were in turn a rehashing of slave codes that were, for example, passed after the Stono Rebellion, and that had been passed multiple times in the course of our history of captivity in this country, right? And so this continuation of codes that are meant to restrict our movement, restrict our independence, to restrict our freedom, have been recycled through our history. And that the most recent term with regard to, this time frame was Jim Crow, okay? And then we fought even during this period. While this period post-Reconstruction was a very tough period because, the weight of white Southern white power tradition was brought to bear upon black people. They had to have us learn our place again after Reconstruction, where we wanted to be in the House of Representatives and be doing all these things white people could do. They had to come down on us real strong, right? And so, this is the time of lynching, of extra legal white terror, right? In ways that really live on in the black psyche, right? In ways that are the backdrop for the black experience in the South, right? And of course, we know institutional terror in the ways of all the slavery by another name. However, black people still did not bow. We did not, we weren't defeated. We resisted, right? And so the last reading that you all have talks about how black folk organized through organizations, churches, but also mutual aid groups that we also call secret societies, right? In order to prevent, white folk from lynching black folk, right? In order to prevent lynchings from happening, in order to help our families in our times of need, when we had loved ones that passed on and had to be buried, right? These groups helped us to make it during hard times, to defend ourselves from white terror, and also to maintain our families, right? And so next week we'll move on into the 20th century and look at how our resistance changes forms, and also how the oppression changes forms. All right. 38 minutes. It was a little long this year, this week. All right. See y'all.